Come on in. Find a comfortable place. Pull the blanket up a little closer. Put in your headphones if you have them. You don't need to do anything right now except listen. I'm going to tell you a story tonight. A true one. It takes place mostly in the woods, in New England, where the autumns are the color of rust and the winters come early and stay long. It's a story about 4 people who disappeared without anyone noticing. About a man who could become anyone he wanted to be. About scientists who refused to let the dead stay nameless. And about a question, one quiet, stubborn question, that science has answered and answered and answered, and still see, and not fully put to rest. There's no hurry tonight. We have all the time in the world. So settle in, close your eyes if you like, and let me take you to the woods. It was November 10th, 1985. The kind of November that New Hampshire does very well. Gray sky, cold air that smells like pine and coming snow. The last of the leaves clinging to branches, like they know something the rest of us don't. A hunter was walking through Bear Brook State Park, just outside the small town of Allenstown, about 10 miles from the state capital of Concord. He wasn't looking for anything unusual, just deer maybe, the crunch of frost under his boots, the quiet that deep woods carry, in a way that feels both peaceful and, if you let it, a little unsettling. And then he saw it, half buried at the base of a slope, partly hidden by leaves and thyme, a large metal drum, the kind you'd use for oil or industrial storage. A 55-gallon barrel, dark with age, sealed shut. He approached it. He shouldn't have opened it, but he did. Inside were 2 bodies, a woman and a young girl, wrapped carefully in plastic, decomposed beyond immediate identification. They had been there, in that barrel, in those woods, for what investigators would later estimate was several years. Police responded. The park was cordoned off. Investigators processed the scene with the tools available to them in 1985. Fingerprints, physical measurements, dental records, blood typing. Nobody claimed them. Nobody came looking. Nobody called a tip line and said, "That sounds like someone I know." The woman was estimated to be in her late 20s to mid-30s. The girl was perhaps 6 or 7 years old. They were given placeholder names the way unidentified victims always are. Clinical, careful, temporary names designed to hold space. Until the real ones could be found. Jane Allenstown Doe. Jane Allenstown Doe, age unknown. WN. Those placeholder names would stay in place for a very long time. The investigation went cold. And the woods of Bear Brook kept their secret. "15 years later, the year 2000, the world had changed enormously since 1985. The internet had arrived, DNA testing had become a staple of criminal investigation. Cell phones were beginning to appear in pockets. And in the woods of Allenstown, New Hampshire, not 300 feet from where the first barrel had been found, the second one was discovered. This one held 2 more children, 2 girls, younger than the first, estimated to have been killed sometime between the late 1970s and the early 1980s. They had been in the ground in those woods beneath the New England snow, and ice and thaw and frost, for nearly 20 years. Now there were 4, a woman and 3 children, for people who had been erased so thoroughly that the entire world had gone about its business. Without noticing they were gone, forensic examiners went to work on what they had. The bones told them some things. The woman stood around 5 feet 4. She was white, likely in her 20s or early 30s at time of death. She had given birth at least once. She had been in reasonable health. The girls ranged in estimated age from roughly 2 to 10 years old. Mitochondrial DNA testing, the kind available in the early 2000s, revealed something important. The woman and 2 of the 3 children shared the same maternal line. They were almost certainly a mother and her daughters. The 3rd child, the one. Let me tell you about the man. His real name, was Terry Petter Rasmussen, but he didn't use that name often. To some people he was Bob Evans, to others Lawrence Vanner, Jerry Mockerman, a series of careful, ordinary-sounding names, each one worn for a while and then discarded, like a coat that no longer fits. Criminologist Jack Levin, who has studied serial killers his entire career, said something about Rasmussen that stays with you. He said, "He is unlike any serial killer I have ever studied." What makes him different, Levin said, is that Rasmussen did not target strangers. He targeted people who trusted him, people who loved him, people who had him into their lives. That is not how most predators work. Most choose distance, anonymity, the randomness of a stranger who cannot be traced back to them. Rasmussen chose intimacy, and that makes him far harder to understand. What we know about his early life is incomplete. By design, it seems. He was born in California in 1943. He moved often. He changed names often. He drifted across the country with an ease that suggested he had been practicing disappearance for a very long time. In the mid-1970s, he was in California, where he met a young woman named Pepper Reed. Pepper was born in 1952 in Texas. She was, by the accounts of those who loved her, bright and warm, and someone who, life should have stretched out long before her. She had a daughter with Rasmussen, a little girl born in 1976, in Orange County, California. And then, sometime in the late 1970s, Pepper Reed and her daughter disappeared from the lives of everyone who knew them. No goodbye, no forwarding address, just gone. Around the same time, a man calling himself Bob Evans appeared in New Hampshire with a woman named Marlies Honeychurch and her 2 young daughters, Marie and Sarah. Marlies was last seen by her family around Thanksgiving of 1978. She had been in California. She had apparently met someone. Her family never heard from her again. Marlies' family spent years looking for her, years of wondering, of filing reports, of telling each other she'll call, she'll come back. Something happened. She'll come back. She didn't come back, and neither did Marie, and neither did Sarah. Bob Evans, or whoever he was, continued his journey. He showed up in arrest records under different names through the 1980s and 90s. Drunk driving here, theft there. A man leaving fingerprints and mugshots scattered across the country, never staying long enough in any one place to be known. Investigators would later describe him as a chameleon. The name stuck, the Chameleon Killer. Now let me slow down for a moment, because this is the part of the story where the science steps in. And I think if you let it, the science is almost as remarkable as the mystery itself. Stay with me. In the early 2000s, DNA testing had become standard in criminal investigations, but there were limits to what it could do. The most common tool at the time was CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, a database built from samples collected from convicted criminals and arrestees. If you had a crime scene DNA sample, you ran it against CODIS. The person was in the data. SEU found them. The problem with the Allenstown 4 was not that they had no DNA. They had plenty. The problem was that the DNA they had was mostly mitochondrial, the kind passed down through the maternal line, useful for establishing family relationships, but far less useful for identifying individuals through a genealogy search, to do the kind of detective work investigators dreamed of, the kind that would eventually catch the Golden State Killer. They needed autosomal DNA, the kind found deep inside the cell nucleus. And here is where something extraordinary happened. Forensic scientists had long believed that autosomal DNA could not be recovered from hair strands that were no longer attached to a living root. When a hair falls out of your head, the cell nucleus and the autosomal DNA inside it begins to break apart almost immediately. By the time years have passed, by the time decades have passed, there is, in theory, nothing left to read. But a forensic laboratory in California had been quietly working on something new, a method to reassemble the broken fragments of autosomal DNA that remain barely in rootless hair, not recover it intact, but piece it back together, the way you might reassemble a photograph that has been torn into very small pieces, patiently, carefully, one fragment at a time. It was painstaking work. It failed more times than it succeeded, and it had never been used in a criminal case before. But investigators in New Hampshire believed in it, and in late 2018, after months of trying, the method worked. They had autosomal DNA from the victim's hair, which meant for the first time, they could do something remarkable. They could listen to what those 4 people had been trying to tell them for 40 years. The first breakthrough did not come from the victims. It came from the killer. In 2017, before the hair DNA method had been perfected, investigators uploaded the perpetrator's DNA profile to GEDmatch, the same public genealogy database that would later help catch the Golden State Killer. They were looking for relatives, anyone who shared enough genetic material to suggest a family connection to the man who had placed those bodies in those barrels. Genetic genealogist Barbara Raventer, the same woman who would later help name the Golden State Killer, took up the case. She began building a family tree, not forward but backward, deep into the past to great-great-grandparents, following every branching line, looking for the place where the DNA from the crime scene intersected with real names, real lives, real people who had simply uploaded their ancestry data, hoping to find a long-lost cousin. It took time, but the tree led somewhere, to a man who had lived many lives under many names, a man who had died in prison in California in 2010, serving a sentence for the murder of his girlfriend Eun Soon Jun, whose body he had dissolved in lye and buried beneath a concrete slab in the backyard of the house they shot. His name was Terry Petter Rasmussen. He had been D.I.D. for 7 years before DNA said his name. It was the first time in history that forensic genetic genealogy had been used to identify a criminal suspect, not the Golden State Killer, Bear Brook. These 4 nameless people in the New Hampshire woods, they were there first. They opened the door. Now they had a name for the killer, but the victims were still nameless. This is the part of the story I find most quietly remarkable, because the science needed to name them had not yet been invented. Barbara Raventer turned her attention to the victims. She had the mitochondrial DNA. She had what little remained in the bones. But to run the kind of genealogy search she needed that autosomal DNA, the kind locked inside cell nuclei, the kind that breaks apart in rootless hair, the kind that was as far as anyone knew gone. Months passed. The forensic lab in California kept trying. The hair was old. The DNA was fragmented. The process failed again and again. And then it worked. Fragments of autosomal DNA painstakingly reassembled from strands of hair that had lain in cold New England ground for 30 years or more were uploaded to GEDmatch. The results came back, and Ray Venter began building the tree. Not for the killer this time, for the mother. At the same time, an amateur investigator named Becky Heath was doing something that true crime communities sometimes do. When official investigations stall, she was searching. Heath had been combing through ancestry websites, following her own quiet hunch. She found a family searching for someone they had lost. A woman who had gone missing around 1978. A mother of 2 daughters. Last seen in California. The timeline matched. Heath followed the thread until it had a name. And in October 2018, she submitted a tip to authorities. Her tip was right. In June of 2019, 34 years after a hunter found a barrel in the woods, New Hampshire officials held a press conference. The woman in the first barrel was Marlies Honeychurch. She was from California. She was a young mother. She had vanished around Thanksgiving of 1978, and her family had spent decades not knowing. The oldest girl was Marie Elizabeth Vaughn. The youngest girl found in the second barrel was Sarah Lynn McQuarters. Both were Marlies' daughters. At the press conference, the New Hampshire Senior Assistant Attorney General said these words, and I want you to hear them slowly. Today we've returned the identities and the dignity to Marlies Honeychurch, Marie Vaughn, and Sarah McQuarters. Returned. Not discovered. Not assigned. Returned. As if those names had always belonged to them, had always been true, and had simply been held somewhere safe, while the world figured out how to give them back. Marlies' family, people who had waited 30 years, learned what had happened to her. They had not stopped looking. They had not stopped believing she would be found. And she was, just not the way anyone had hoped. But there was still a fourth victim, the girl in the second barrel, who was not related to Marlies, not one of her daughters, someone else. She was smaller than the others, estimated to have been between 2 and 4 years old when she died. Investigators knew from the DNA evidence that Terry Rasmussen was her biological father, but her mother, and therefore her identity, remained unknown. For years she was called Jane Allenstown Doe 2000, the year the second barrel was found, while the story of the Bear Brook murders was covered in podcasts, in articles, in documentaries. While Marlies and Marie and Sarah were finally named, this little girl remained a question. The New Hampshire State Police Cold Case Unit never closed the file. They called her, quietly, by the name they gave her in their hearts, though they could not yet prove it. They called her Ray. In 2024, investigators partnered with a volunteer organization called the DNA Doe Project, a group of forensic genealogists who donate their skills to identifying unidentified remains. They had the autosomal DNA from her hair. They began the search. The family tree led back to a couple born in the 1870s, then forward, branch by branch, name by name, until they found a great-great-great-granddaughter. A woman who appeared in a 2005 obituary. The obituary mentioned she was survived by a daughter named Pepper Reed. Investigators searched for Pepper Reed. They found records of her birth in Texas in 1952. They found records of her youth, and then the record stopped. In the late 1970s, Pepper Reed disappeared from the world. But from those records, investigators found something else. A birth certificate, filed in Orange County, California in 1976. A daughter born to Pepper Reed. The DNA Doe Project says that within 30 minutes of finding that birth certificate, 30 minutes, they had the name they had been looking for. On September 7, 2025, the New Hampshire Attorney General announced that the fourth victim had been identified, Ray Rasmussen, born in 1976 in Orange County, California, the biological daughter of Terry Petter Rasmussen and Pepper Reed, between 2 and 4 years old when she died. New Hampshire State Police Detective Sergeant Christopher Elphick said these words at the announcement: "We never forgot Ray. We never stopped looking." All 4 victims now have their names: Marlies, Marie, Sarah, Ray. The woods of Bear Brook State Park no longer hold their secret. And now I want to tell you the other part of the story, the part where the science goes quiet. Terry Rasmussen is dead. He died in 2010 in a California prison, serving a sentence for the murder of Eun Soon Jun. He never stood trial for Bear Brook. He never said the names Marlies or Marie or Sarah or Ray. He never told anyone why. And because he is dead, there are questions that may never be answered. Pepper Reed, Ree's mother and Terry Rasmussen's former partner, has not been seen since the late 1970s. Authorities believe she is almost certainly another of his victims. The investigation into her disappearance remains active, but she has not been found. Denise Bowden, a woman who was last seen with Rasmussen in Manchester, New Hampshire in 1981, has also never been accounted for. Investigators believe she is likely another victim. She has not been found either. And then there is the broader question, the one that investigators speak about carefully, choosing their words with the precision of people who understand the weight of what they're saying. Terry Rasmussen was a man who moved constantly, who changed his name constantly, who had relationships with women, and then those women disappeared. California, New Hampshire, Arizona, Oregon, Texas, Virginia. His known movements span a decade and a half, and crossed the country several times over. State Police Detective Elphick said, simply, "It's highly unlikely that he stopped doing what he was doing. It's certainly possible we're going to make some more discoveries, not just about the whereabouts of Pepper Reed and Denise Bowden, but additional victims as well." Additional victims. 2 words spoken very quietly. No one knows how many people Terry Rasmussen harmed in the years before Bear Brook. In the years between Bear Brook and his arrest for Eun Soon Jun's murder, he left behind him a long trail of assumed names and gaps in the record, spaces where a person might have been and simply is no longer. I want to end tonight not with answers, but with something quieter than that. The science that identified the victims of Bear Brook, the technique of building a family tree from fragments of DNA found in rootless hair, had never been done before this case. This case invented it. These 4 people, Marlies, Marie, Sarah, and Ray, by remaining unnamed for so long, forced the science to reach further. They And it ever had. Because of them, hundreds of other unidentified victims have been named. Because of them, the DNA Doe Project exists. Because of them, forensic genealogists like Barbara Ray Venter were taken seriously, funded, and given the cases that no one else could crack. There is something in that worth sitting with. That 4 people who were hidden so carefully, erased so thoroughly, ended up changing the way the world finds its missing. That in trying to make them disappear forever, the man who put them in those bars accidentally made them unforgettable. But the story is not over. Somewhere, perhaps, are women who loved Terry Rasmussen and trusted him, and then vanished. Pepper Reed is out there somewhere. In the ground, or in water, or in woods, waiting. The New Hampshire Cold Case Unit is still working. The DNA Doe Project is still working. Investigators in California and Arizona and Texas are still pulling at threads. There is a question this case keeps asking. Not low. Delay. Not dramatically. Just quietly. Persistently. The way cold cases do. How many names are still out there? How many people move through the world at the sight of a man like this? Trusting him, building a life with him. And then one day simply, we're not there anymore? We may find out. The science keeps moving forward. The databases keep growing. And DNA, as we have learned, does not forget. Not after 10 years. Not after 30. Not after 40. It simply waits, in the ground, in the hair, in the cold, for someone patient enough to listen. That's the story of Bear Brook tonight. Of Marlies, of Marie, of Sarah, of Ray, of a man W.O. thought the woods would keep his secrets forever, and of the science that proved him wrong, one fragment at a time. Sleep well tonight, and remember, someone air right now. Someone is in a quiet lab. Running a test, following a thread, getting very close to giving someone their name back. The work doesn't stop, even while you sleep. Asterisk, this has been The Barrels in the Woods, a confidential crime scene bedtime true crime story. Asterisk. Subscribe for a new case next week. Turn off the light. Good night.